Welcome to Full Prefrontal, the show that exposes the mysteries of executive function. This podcast is a collection of conversations about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which impacts your focus, planning, problem-solving, emotional balance, and independence. So join us as we explore executive function and the science of learning. And now, here's your host, the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.
Welcome back to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. I'm your host, Sucheta Kamath. I believe by tying the findings from neuroscience, psychology, and education into everyday transformation, a lot can happen to our personal and collective growth. This podcast is fueled by three goals, and you might have to forgive me for repeating some of this, but one is to explain what executive function truly is and how it is crucial for our personal development, self-sufficiency, and even moral development. Second, it is to help motivate the current self, to investigate the blind spots for personal challenges, to learn new ways of being so that the future self is better off. And lastly, but not the least, is help people create a playbook for personal success by mastering executive function skills with specific ideas, tips, and strategies. And one particular skill we're going to talk about is forgiveness. And I'm wondering, starting in April of 1994, for next 100 days, the Rwanda Hutus went on a killing spree, annihilating close to 1 million Rwandan Tutsis, their fellow countrymen. Among the dead were several John Paul's family. So I'm going to share the story of John Paul Samputu, and he is now become an activist, and he writes. There's a wonderful project I'm going to about to explain to you. But the shock was so great that I started drinking and taking drugs to forget. I wanted to take revenge. I wanted to kill Vincent. Vincent was his neighbor, and he actually killed his 80-year-old father and his siblings and his mother and many his family members. But I couldn't find him, so I started killing myself. And this is the bane of today's conversation. How desire to take revenge festers into our hearts, maybe even causing incredible destruction. Douglas Horton once said that while seeking revenge, dig two graves, one for yourself. So nothing is quite satisfying as well-executed revenge, where by taking the justice into one's own hands feels empowering, quenching the thirst for fairness. However, there's another option. The conventional wisdom often refers to that as taking the higher road, letting the better self win against the catty, shallow, and spiteful self. Then why do we struggle with forgiveness? So today's guest is going to totally open that for us, and is going to share his wisdom. Today we have Nathaniel Wade, who received his Ph.D. from Virginia Commonwealth University in 2003. He then joined Iowa State the same year. He's a professor of psychology there, also the director of training for the counseling psychology program, and founding director of Network Community Counseling Service. He's also a licensed psychologist in the state of Iowa. His research interests center on the process and outcomes of psychotherapy, which is fantastic because a lot of times our guests have been researchers, but he has true hands-on experience of how to make the difference using the science and findings. He has published over 100 articles, books, chapters. He's a co-editor of two scholarly handbooks and has received grant funding from federal and private grant agencies. I can't wait for his book. I hope it's in the making. Welcome to the podcast, Nathaniel. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me on.
So, human relationships are complex, and interactions amongst us are often laden with complicated interpersonal and intrapersonal transgressions, leading to one offending the other, with or without intending to do so, right? So what offenses are worthy of forgiveness? Or maybe first question should be, what is forgiveness?
It's a great place to start. Forgiveness, trying to define it is really tricky when you actually get down to it. So I come from, like you mentioned in the introduction, I come from both a kind of a science and practice perspective. Yeah. So anytime we're trying to do scientific studies of a particular topic, we need to try and figure out what it is that we're studying. So figuring out what forgiveness is took up a lot of time early on in psychological studies of forgiveness, which goes back to about the late 80s into the 90s. So for me, because I'm mostly interested in studying forgiveness in these clinical settings, so when someone comes to counseling, comes to psychotherapy, they've been hurt in pretty dramatic ways often, and they have a desire to forgive, but they haven't been able to figure it out. Like, how do I do this? I can't get beyond the rumination. I can't get beyond the anger or the depression or the anxiety that's associated with this person or this offense. So that's kind of where I'm most interested. And so for me, I'm really interested in forgiveness that is more than just setting aside revenge, which is an important part of forgiveness. But it's about, for me, not only letting go of the bitterness, not only letting go of the negative, maybe vengeful rumination, but it's also about taking on something more, about transforming those emotions into something else. Oftentimes, if people are hurt by people who are close to them, it's about restoring the relationship that they had with that person to some degree. And so for me, it's about forgiveness itself is about a restoration of kind of pro-social attitudes and feelings toward that person, not necessarily a reconciliation, which perhaps we can come back to later. Yes. But an important part of the process may or may not be restoring the relationship.
It's so interesting. So what I'm understanding is there's any hurt, which is basically, can I say that hurt, the origin of hurt is a disappointment or a letdown or a manipulation or exploitation? There are many forms of hurt, right? And
that's right.
Secondly, once the hurt occurs, we have this deep and we have had, Dr. Ryan Martin, who talked about this, components of anger. One is fairness, second is poor treatment, and third is goal blockage. So those are three reasons we get angry. And so somebody who puts their goals ahead of us, somebody who is unfair to us, or somebody has these assumptions about our worthiness can lead to a sense of hurt. So then I'm going to share something. When I was a young girl, and I hated being teased. I had a lot of nicknames, but given my family, and which is not like nicknames as a bad thing. It was nicknames as many ways of endearing ways, but some nicknames were not kind of flattering, which is very annoying. And the teasing, as you know, was making fun of rather than, it wasn't done as in a good spirit. It felt like there was some meanness to it. But what was so interesting is that was the whole family dynamic, that my distant cousins, my uncles, aunts, my grandparents, they all talked to each other like that. They were very verbal, but they talked like that. And if you express some sense of hurt, they were like, come on, I'm just joking. So I felt picking on people was not nice. It was poor treatment, now that I understand that framework. And it was done in poor taste. But by that stance, I often got this label of you're too sensitive. And then it kind of shut down even my desire to object to not do that to children. Part of my reason to go into, and I'm very protective of children, is this. So I was wondering, this kind of hurt doesn't necessarily beg for forgiveness, does it? Because it's not extreme, like, you talk about, and we'll get to it, but more severe forms of hurt. So can we start from this low tech hurt? And how do we deal with that? It's really, I don't know, a tiny needle. It's not a dagger.
Yeah. I think so many hurts that people carry are just like that. It's, if one time your uncle teased you one time with a nickname, you probably wouldn't even remember it to be able to talk to me about it. But if it was 100 times or 100,000 times, it starts to weigh, particularly if that's a sensitivity for you, which again is something that we all vary on, what kind of lands on our radar. And so I think that absolutely is within the realm of the forgiveness topic. And so, for me, that may even be something that somebody brings to a counseling situation. I could easily imagine someone who's, oh yeah, well, we've got this holiday coming up and I'm going to be seeing all these people again. And I just don't want to. Why don't you want to? Tell me about that. Well, They always come up with these nicknames. Okay, let's talk about this,
Yes.
right? And so, part of the forgiveness process that we often talk about and is so crucial in therapy is the idea of being able to kind of set the boundary first before we try to move toward forgiveness. And so, you think of what some researchers call pseudo forgiveness, or you might think of it as like a harmful or fake forgiveness, is the kind of forgiveness that's like, oh, okay. Like, you did that to me. Okay, I'll just take it. Right. And a lot of people are rightfully upset about that kind of a forgiveness. Wait, where's the justice? Wait, where's the righteous anger? And for us, at least in my work, I think that's a crucial part of it. So if I'm working with a client, the very first thing I want to do is talk about, where do you draw the line? So now you're an adult. Do you get to say to your family members, don't call me that? I don't appreciate it, and I don't want you to call me that. That seems very appropriate to me. Maybe before we even start talking about you forgiving what they've said to you.
Wow. And, I will tell you, sorry, Dr. Wade, this is becoming a session. I'm sorry.
Well, I can't help it. I'm sorry.
I bet Thanksgiving for you is like, oh my God, start paying people.
Hey, and me too. My wife has to counsel me. So there.
Yes. And as you're saying about all these things, I just realized, as an adult, I began to assert, and people thought, whoa, here she is, like, okay, she doesn't like it. Then I got teased about like being like forthcoming. Right. I remember it was a hilarious story, but my mother's sister, she's a few years younger, and she had two children who are like 5-6 years younger to me. And when I was in college, I stayed with them. And during that period, so by then they were like, I was 19. So they were 14, 15, and then my aunt got pregnant. And then I decided to open my big fat mouth and counseled her how she should deliver this to her children, that she's now going to have another baby. And she thought, like, why do they need to even know? They're children, so there was no plan of telling the kids or it might disrupt family dynamics. And here I was fretting and sweating about what's going to happen to these children. So bottom line is, as you can see, I'm very sensitive. Okay, I get it. So as
which is a gift. I'll just say it. I just put it out there. It's a gift.
You know what? I've started telling people I'm very perceptive. I don't tell people I'm sensitive. I tell I'm very perceptive. Right. And I think so. I understand human relationships.
I love that.
And I deeply care about it. So what is the relationship between anger and forgiveness? And what are the processes of, as you come to the stage of forgiveness? What happens to human emotions once you're hurt?
Yeah. So for me, I look at, anger as a basic emotion. And I follow the work of Les Greenberg and others who have done emotion-focused therapy, where they're talking about, emotions teach us very important things. They give us important information. So if we're angry, there's something important there.
Yes.
Now, a lot of us don't like to feel angry, or a lot of us have been taught by our families or culture, we can't be angry, or you have to, really strangle your anger, whatever. So then forgiveness gets to be one of those ways by which society controls anger. Well, you're just supposed to forgive. And again, that, like I said before, that is not where I'm coming from at all. So the relationship between anger and forgiveness for me is really about like the steps. So anger is giving important information. What's happening? Now, if this is anger about something that happened 10 years ago, we want to process that. We want to talk about it. And then we can probably start moving toward forgiveness. If this is anger about something that happened yesterday, then we're not going to be talking about forgiveness right away. No. We need to be figuring out like what happened. What steps do you need to take to keep yourself safe? What steps do you need to take to communicate to the person who hurt you that isn't okay, that you're not going to allow that? Do you have to bring in resources to do that? The help of a therapist or the help of a family member or, whatever, to be able to do that. And then once that gets, again, established, in a sense, once we respond to the anger, like what the anger is teaching us, that these boundaries have been violated, then later we can move toward, okay, and if you're having trouble putting away the anger, now we can start working on that. And then we move toward forgiveness, which to me is more of like a process or a state, not quite an emotion in the same way that anger is. You don't all of a sudden, well, I guess some people do all of a sudden feel forgiving, but to me, it's different than that. Like when I'm moving with clients and working with them on forgiveness, I'm moving more toward a state that includes, like I said, the reduction in these kind of difficult or uncomfortable, bitter kinds of emotions, more toward pro-social, loving, empathic kinds of feelings. Those together make up the process of forgiveness.
So it's interesting. Maybe you can tell us a little bit, our listeners, about the term pro-social, because people may not understand that. And I'm curious if you see a bridge between one's, toning down your emotions, so kind of bringing them down, like their high level of rage or high level of spitefulness, then you keep it down. So would equanimity, or would that be at the end? Because the pro-social or even loving kindness feelings towards somebody who has been the perpetrator sounds a huge leap for people.
Right, exactly. And those are toward the end. The equanimity, or the idea of a loving kindness stance towards someone who has hurt us, is really kind of, for me, like a last step in this forgiveness process. And it's also, I would say, a fluid place. So one of the things that we talk about in our kind of organized interventions when we provide them to people specifically on forgiveness, one of the things that we often talk about at the end is, and this comes from Everett Worthington's work and his REACH model, the last REACH stands for 5 steps of forgiveness, and the last one, H, is holding on to forgiveness.
Can you just walk us through the REACH?
Yeah.
That would be great.
So R is recalling the hurt. So that's kind of what we've been talking about right now. It's giving people space to talk about what happened. So in the forgiveness process, we aren't shutting down people. We aren't telling them, oh, it wasn't that bad, or you need to just get over it, or forgive and forget. No, we don't do that at all. We tell, what happened? Tell us. Let's explore this. Let's understand it. And then in E, once the person has had a chance to talk about it, E is empathy, building empathic understanding for the other person's situation. And so most of the time when we're hurt by people, who've done something mean, done something bad, done something hurtful, traumatic even. But a lot of times those people are just trying to solve problems that they're having. Now, they might be self-centered in the way that they're doing it. They may be inconsiderate in the way that they're doing it. But most people aren't looking to hurt just to hurt people for their own, for the fun of it. And so if we try and get some empathy for the person's situation, that really can help a lot. And then A is altruistic gift, or acknowledging forgiveness. I kind of think of those as 2 steps where basically you're moving to an understanding, and this continues to help build empathy. It's, when have I been someone who's hurt another? When have I really stung someone? And when I did that and I realized it, well, how did I feel? Was I like, oh, good? Well, sometimes I might have been, but a lot of times I'm not. A lot of times I'm like, oh, shoot. Now, I might not admit it to the person, but inside I'm kind of like, I wish I hadn't done that, or I wish it hadn't come out that way. And I kind of wish that the person would forgive me. And so there's kind of an acknowledgement of like that shared humanity, that if we can get that sense of like, the person who hurt me is also like me and I'm like them, then that grows that empathic understanding, which is when you get that, that's a big leap toward forgiveness. And so then when you get to C, the 4th step, that's committing to forgiveness. And so we acknowledge that forgiveness is hard and we kind of have to make a commitment to doing it. And when we've gotten there, we kind of make a commitment that says like, okay, I've made this progress. And so we do some interventions and do some activities around that. And then the last one, H, holding on to forgiveness.
Wow.
That's the one where we acknowledge, hey, just because you've gotten to a place with me as a therapist where you feel like, hey, I feel more forgiving, doesn't mean you're always going to stay there, particularly emotionally. So emotionally, you might get, just imagine you haven't seen the person who hurt you in 6 months, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, they call you, or you see them in the store, or somebody close to you starts talking about them. And what happens? Well, it's pretty likely you're going to get that, all those emotions are going to come back. It doesn't mean you haven't forgiven, and you can remind yourself of that executive function to bring yourself back down on the emotion side and come back to kind of the reasons, the rationality of like, wait a second. Okay, I've made this progress. I'm not feeling it right now, but that's okay. I've made the progress and I'm still okay with it. So that's the model we often use. And then I've kind of tweaked that in my own work, depending on the setting, but that's the core we use.
And I would love to know in what parts you have modified it and your reasons for it. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to kind of intersect with one experience I had, not experience, but as in preparation for this interview, I was looking for like, there's revenge is at one side, which is movies and crazy ways people have taken revenge, and award-winning movies for fantastic, or Kill Bill if you know the whole series, Kill Bill series, right? Quentin Tarantino for the bloodbath, and then there's I came across Eve Ensler's book. That she wrote an apology, The Apology. I don't know if you have read it. I haven't highly recommend that to everyone who's listening. One profound thing about that was, of course, she wrote this book 30 years after her father had passed away. And her father molested her since age 5 until age 10, but never acknowledged, and then continued to be extremely violent and incredibly, incredibly difficult parent. And considering, who she is as an activist, as a feminist, a great writer, orator, I feel she has, given us a gift. But to see 30 years, it took her 30 years to compose that. But what she did in this book, she wrote a letter from her father to her, apologizing for something he never did to her. And in many of your work, you talk about that, but it is such a profound and most beautiful way that I have read. If somebody who has been a perpetrator can take it upon themselves to bring healing to somebody that they have affected in the profound negative ways. So I would like to know a little bit about your work and how do you study forgiveness and how have you imbibed these principles, and maybe origin story, like what got you to think about the need for forgiveness and really healing through forgiveness? So many questions. Sorry, bundled up.
That's okay. Shall I start up? I'll start up with the kind of the origin.
That'd be great.
We can move into kind of what I'm doing and kind of how I've done this. Okay, so I would say that my story around forgiveness has 2 parts. The first part is super simple. The second part is much more involved. Part 1 is, to answer the question of how did I get involved in forgiveness research, was basically I wanted to work with Everett Worthington at Virginia Commonwealth University. And at about the time when I applied to graduate school, which was in 1998, he had just moved into forgiveness. He had just published one of his first books on forgiveness with a couple of his grad students, and he had a lot of different research projects going. But I didn't know that because it was too new. I was aware of his religion and spirituality work. Wow. And that was what I was really interested in, is how do we use religion and spirituality in psychotherapy? Is that appropriate? How do we do that? That sort of thing. And he had done a lot of work in that. So when I showed up for graduate school to work with him, that's for a first meeting with him. He sent me out with a stack. This is back in the days of actual paper. Yes. A stack of papers that went from my waist to my chin, and said, here's your first project, read these things. And then we're going to do a literature review, which ended up being published in 1999, Worthington and Wade, a model of forgiveness and how it works.
I just finished reading it yesterday for the first time. Sorry.
Great. Excellent. That's
fantastic.
Great. No, I love
fantastic.
It.
Yes.
Thank you. So that was kind of very practical. He was doing it. I wanted to work with him, so I was doing it. But more, the second part then was in that first year, as I was working on that 1999 article. At the time, I was married, and I had been married for about, I guess that would have been about 3 or 4 years at that point. And I found out that my wife was having an affair. And all of a sudden, all the theoretical work became very, very practical. And so, it was, as you can imagine, it was a very hard, difficult time for me. That was something that was a value of mine that was, heart wrenching that was broken.
So sorry.
And yeah, I appreciate that. And I've been able to go through that process. So one of the things that really stood out to me was in our work around the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, honestly. And so I got to the point where initially, of course, I felt all the betrayal and anger and bitterness that came from that, the shock, the dismay, those things that are very common for people who have experienced this. And then within months, I thought, I'm not ready to forgive for sure. But someday I want to, right? So someday I want to be able to let this kind of put this aside. But the fear was, if I put it aside,
Can I ask you,
then does that mean I have to get back with her?
How did you even get that feeling? Because people are so engulfed in their own negative emotions that they don't come up for air. So that's pretty interesting and amazing. You did that at such a young age. So what was that motivated that?
I think the one thing that I remember really motivating it was it was like the narrative, and I don't know even scientifically if this is true, but I think it is, the narrative of like, it'll haunt me if I don't let it aside. Like even whether it was with her or with another person in the future, does that mean then that I'm going to always be kind of afraid or always be worried that they're going to have an affair too? And, and I didn't want that. Like, I didn't want that baggage in a sense,
You're protective of your future self. That's fantastic.
I was. Yes, that's right.
Really great.
That's a great way of saying it. Yeah. So, it came to the point where I realized, like, because of some of our work with Ev was, hey, forgiveness and reconciliation are actually two separate processes. So I can work on forgiveness of my first wife, and then I can make a decision about reconciliation later. So in that process for us of what happened and do we get back together and where are we at, I was able to kind of focus on just the forgiveness part. Like, again, what happened to me? What did she do? What contributions maybe did I have to that? What was she going through? Can I gain some empathy for her situation? All those things that I just talked about in that 5-step process came to a point of like, okay, like I'm getting some level of forgiveness for her, within first 2 years, within the first 2 years, I was like, okay, I'm getting some, not a lot. And it didn't take much to bring the bitterness and the anger back. But yeah, I was getting some. And then I guess it was about 1.5 years in, we finally got to the point where we needed to make a decision one way or the other. We had been separated for that long and it was time. And that was when then I took on the kind of reconciliation process. Do I want that or not? And we talked and we looked and I thought a lot. And I talked to a lot of my friends and family and finally got to the point where I was like, no, I don't want to do the reconciliation process with her. We didn't have any kids. I didn't sense from her that she had any real particular overarching desire to be with me. And I thought, I'm ready to move on. And so then that's basically what I did is I eventually forgave her, but we never reconciled.
Well, sorry for the mishap, but look how many of us have benefited from that. So thank you.
That's right. That's right. And it really drove home like the practicality of what I was doing.
Yeah.
Right. And really made it.
Another question comes to mind is it fair to say that forgiveness is more internalized mechanism, but reconciliation involves externalizing that process because you're involving other people with whom you're reconciling or kind of negotiating that space with the world, right?
Absolutely. Again, I'll say kind of a shout out here to my colleagues who are in social psychology and IO and other kinds of fields. Some of them would actually look at forgiveness and define it as both things. They would look at forgiveness and say, no, forgiveness is actually both. It's the internal process and it's that working on the relationship.
I see.
Whereas for me, as a counseling psychologist in a therapy setting, I want to be able to separate those out because what about all the clients who maybe are dealing with parents who are dead or who are dealing with people who are downright toxic and hurtful? I don't want to have to encourage them to get back into a relationship in order to forgive. So I want to be able to separate those out. But again, I just want to acknowledge not all forgiveness researchers would necessarily separate those out in their definition.
And we, in fact, had, Franz de Waal, who is a primatologist, who has done a lot of work in reconciliation in the primates. And one of the things that kind of when I had that conversation with him, what was very striking to me that this common myth that we have floating that we are far superior to our primate compadres, I guess, but we're not. They are doing it already.
Right. That's
and
right.
even like through a hug and a kiss, I guess, and sometimes with sex from certain primates. So,
right.
So now let's talk about how do you measure forgiveness change or the act of forgiveness, and you also talk about unforgiving state of not unforgiving, if I'm correct. There's no double negative. So maybe tell us a little bit more about the precursor stages of that.
Yeah. So we've worked a lot in my lab. Certainly, lots of different psychology labs have been working on kind of measurements of forgiveness. Mostly what we've settled on in our work is self-report. So people reporting on kind of their states. And so the way then we kind of measure forgiveness, of course, we do have general measures of just like open-ended, like, or I should say face valid. How much have you forgiven?
Oh,
right?
okay.
So we just, here's what we think of forgiveness. How much have you done this thing?
I see.
But we also back those up with other scales. So, and what you're getting at is we do have some scales that I would call kind of measures of unforgiveness. So Mike McCullough has done great work in this area. Early on in his career, he put out a scale that measured desires for revenge against and the desire to avoid the offender, the offending person. And then later, he and some colleagues added benevolence, so a desire or a motivation to act benevolently toward a person. But to me, those are those two different sides. So the unforgiveness part to me is really the desire for that revenge, the desire to avoid the person. And actually, I specifically work on kind of focus in on the revenge part rather than the avoidance, because there are some cases, as I said, clients that I'd work with that I would actually say have forgiven, but still would score high on avoidance because the person's just going to hurt them again. Why get back? And
is it gender specific? Like men tend to seek revenge more and women tend to avoid?
There's a little bit of evidence for gender differences. And of course, you're tapping into, kind of at least here in the West and probably in other cultures as well, where men are allowed to have one emotion and it's anger.
Stereotypes.
At least traditional masculinity, right? If you follow that, and then women are, basically allowed to be sad and depressed and anxious, but they're not allowed to be angry. And so you see some of that, although, you look at millennials and younger, and I think a lot of that is changing.
They're going all about avoiding. Men, women, doesn't matter. And it
doesn't matter.
Another interesting thing just occurred to me. I watch too many crime shows, you can tell, but women tend to poison and men tend to use violent action. So poison to me is a more passive way of, taking a revenge,
Right. That's right.
Avoiding confrontation,
we all
but
find
killing
our
them
ways.
softly.
Yeah, we find our ways, don't we? Yeah.
So, sorry, continue.
That's right. No, fine. So then we use those scales to measure, and then we also look at like Mike McCullough's scale, the benevolence that looks at trying to kind of get at that more positive feelings towards someone. We have scales of empathy, like how empathic do you feel toward this person? I have a scale of rumination about a specific offense or injury that a person experienced that we use again to get at kind of how much do I play this
over and
over in my mind as a measure of forgiveness. And so all those, usually when I do my studies, and most of my forgiveness work, not all of it, but most of it is really focused on like in the clinic. So what's happening if we do an intervention with people who are interested in trying to forgive? We do some sort of kind of counseling or psychoeducational intervention with them. What happens? And then we look at all those variables kind of as a set, and that gets us at kind of forgiveness. That's kind of how we measure that.
Wow. So share with us one of your favorite experiments and why.
Yeah.
You have many interesting ways of tapping into that. I know.
Several for sure. Yeah. But I'll tell you what really gets me excited, and which is kind of too bad because you have to be a bit of a glutton for punishment to do these kinds of studies, are the true, like, counseling or psychotherapy studies where you actually train therapists, you bring in people from the community who are really seeking help. Yeah, they're in a study, but they're really there for the counseling. And then you track all that and study all that. It's super complicated at times to do, but it's so gratifying. So I think one of the ones that was probably, well, there's two that come to mind. So one that we've been talking a lot about is forgiving other people. And so we did an intervention. We had about 150 people complete the study. We had maybe 200 people who started the study.
That's an amazing number, by the way.
And then dropped out. And so we had like 24, I think it was 23 or 24 separate therapy groups. We put them together into small groups to do the work, 12 different therapists. And, the stories coming out of there, I say this all the time. You've probably heard this before, heard me say this before, but it's like the reports from the study, the data, they always shock me. Like, oh my goodness, like this really works.
Wow.
like, like I'm the researcher, right? I'm the one that's supposed to believe this, right? And it shocks me. Like I'm really like, that can't be true. Like they're just making that up. They're just saying that. But it's like, not every participant, of course, but participant after participant will write in the open-ended comments, this is the best thing. This changed my life. This was so helpful. And then of course it shows up in their data as well over time. When they come in, they're very high on these rumination and you just see it over the course of the treatment. They're coming down, down, down. And so, that was a really satisfying study, but it was complicated. It was hard to do.
I know. And I was just really impressed by what's the term, but long-standing impact. It's just not a short-term. I mean, the intervention was short, but the impact continues to last. I don't know if you have that ongoing tracking, but that was really remarkable.
Yeah. We did that one time in a study just prior. It was kind of like a build-up or pilot study for the one I was just talking about. Again, a very similar group. So we put people together in groups, and then we followed up with them. I think it was 2 years later, and just to check in. And we actually sent them their handwritten descriptions of the offense. We said, remember, this is what you came in to work on. Now read over this and then fill out the forms. 2 years later, same change, just flat.
Wow.
From the time they finished, they basically went forgiveness up after the intervention, and then they just stayed flat. It was like, again, that was another one of those moments. I was like, nah, they didn't. Like, they're just being nice. Like, they can't, like, they have to have gone down, but no.
But
at least the data.
What it reminds me of, it's like having a closure. Forgiveness is such a strong way to put a lock on that door and say, I don't need to go in there anymore. Right?
That's right. Yep. And you know what? I'm going to take your analogy, if I can, and just twist it a little bit. So here's what I would say is, you go, instead of locking that room back up and putting a lock on it, it's now you've opened it up, you've cleaned it out,
emptied the furniture,
and now you can actually use that room.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, that's better.
Right? It's not holding your trash anymore. You've taken the trash out, right? So now I can use it for other things, right? I've expanded my awareness, or I've expanded my ability to live more fully.
You'll get a kick out of this. Recently, I heard a Bangladeshi a woman from Bangladesh, Myanmar, I guess, wrote a book, and it's called The Starter Wife. And very interesting sidebar, by the way. But in that story, so she is a wife of a startup company, and anyway, she personally, the author personally had this experience of her husband. Both were professors. Husband started something. Anyway, in that company, hypothetically, she had like a group of startup women women in the startup. And so as like fake concept she came up with. And one such concept was called empty. So she said, just to go with my fake story, I had a friend who was a web designer. I had that person build a website for me. And so in the party, she would run by people this idea that, there's this company that does this, which is fake, but she would guide them to go to the website. And then this particular idea took off without it being existent, which was empty. So the idea was you reach out to the company, and the company mails you a box, empty box. Okay. 4x4. And then you fill it with whatever you need, like whatever is giving you trouble. And then you mail it, and then the company disposes it off, which you can throw it in your trash, by the way. But that just reminded me of like, what a way to heal.
That's great. Right. Totally.
Fake
Oh, yeah.
meaning, but it became
there's
meaningful.
something like ritualistic
Yes.
about it. Almost. It's more than like just, I'm going to put it in my own trash. Like, I'm going to put it in a box and I'm going to send it to
I knew
someone.
you would have much
Right?
better understanding of that than the author was
it's
explaining.
great.
That was so great.
It's great. And, we do that in some of these interventions where we actually have like rituals that we'll have people do.
Really? Such as?
Oh, yeah. So when we get to the part about like committing to forgiveness, we'll have people, a good example is let's put down on paper everything, like all the negative consequences of this, So, for me, it was, can I trust people in the future? The hurt that I had to deal with, a B on my stats exam because I found out that she was cheating on me the Sunday before I had a stats exam.
No.
It's like, so I'm just, putting all these things down, right? So then after that, once you have the list, when you're ready to commit to forgiveness, you take it and you burn it.
Wow.
And so there's this ritual sense of, or you take it and bury it if you don't like fire.
Or flush
so there's
in the
ways
toilet.
that we can ritualize it, flush it down the toilet if you like that. Yeah. So kind of doing that and doing it in a group is really helpful. So if everyone is writing out their lists and everyone is going home and destroying it, then they come back and they tell their stories. And there's that, there's that community, the ritual, that gets built in that's super healing for us.
So are some people better at forgiving than the other? Is this related to personality traits? Is it related to culture, upbringing? I can imagine narcissists struggling with this, causing a lot of harm, but not taking responsibility.
Right. Absolutely. So there's a whole list of things that researchers have found that are related to forgiveness, particularly if you're looking at, we've been talking today about what I would call state forgiveness. And more specifically, I'll also add state emotional forgiveness. So an important distinction's been made among kind of the state forgiveness, right? Decisional versus emotional.
Oh, can you define that along the way too? Because I don't think we talked about that. Yes.
Yeah, we haven't. So decisional forgiveness is really the kind of forgiveness often comes from people's moral systems, religion, spirituality. It might come from a family system where they say, you know what, I'm going to make a decision to forgive you. Now, it's not related to how I really feel, maybe. I still really am PO'd about what you did. However, I'm making a decision to forgive you. And so they might move toward, that might make them move toward being kind to the person when they don't want to, interacting with them at a holiday in a polite and pleasant way because they're making a decision, a willful decision. Emotional forgiveness is really what I study. And that's how do we get you to really feel forgiving toward this person? And so that's the distinction there. But both of those are what I would call state forgiveness. It's forgiveness that I feel for a specific offense, for something kind of specific. But there's another kind of forgiveness that researchers have spent a lot of time looking at, and that's trait forgiveness. And so that's the tendency to be forgiving over time, across situations, across people. And for sure, that exists.
Embodying that, right?
Yes.
Whether hurt or not, you are that person. Yeah.
Right. So you have individual differences on this. So you have some people who pretty much they're not going to be very forgiving. And then you have other people who are really forgiving. And then, of course, there's most of us who are somewhere in the middle. And then, of course, just because you're high trait forgiving, meaning you tend to forgive all the time or a lot, doesn't mean you won't be unforgiving about a particular events, right? Because that's just one particular offense. But it doesn't mean you're likely to be more forgiving than the other folks. And then when we look back to your question of what's related to that, then we start to see some stronger and more stable relationships with certain factors like personality and kind of offense specific things and things like that. So, but personality is really interesting.
So what just occurred to me that maybe people who offend more tend to be people who lack impulse control, people who are socially inept or insensitive to the needs of the others. Typically, if you think about it, a lot of the clients that I work with are not really aware. They're not bad people. They're just, they're either in a rush. So they're trampling on other people, they're cutting lanes and they're like, then they're mad and they're, giving a birdie, that kind of thing. But forgiveness, I wonder, because that also requires you to hang back and shift your perspective and also have large heart, which kind of says many things. And that requires working memory, by the way, to hold on to conflicting information that person is a good person, but they have affected me badly, maybe they deserve forgiveness, because I think there's a big barrier, which is deservedness. Can you talk a little bit about that? Do you see that in your work?
Oh my goodness, you have just touched on like so many great things. So many. I mean, what do I choose? The first one I'll take is kind of the last one. Yeah, right. Okay. So the last one you gave of like this, they did this hurtful thing to me, but they're a decent person. The kind of the complexity of thought that comes. What I might throw out in a therapy group, the maturity that it takes to be able to see that. But that's kind of an executive function, isn't it? It's an ability to be able to hold those things and say, wait a second. It's not just black and white. It's not just on or off. There's more complexity here. And so here's a decent person who did something really bad. Is that okay? Can that go together? Oh, it can go together.
Because people are complex.
Right. But that takes a lot, doesn't it? So so that's one. The other thing is, I don't know if you're, I'm sure you've seen this, but the research on self-control and forgiveness.
Yes. That's what I was going to ask you. Such a inverse relationship.
So there's good research on, there's, I think it was in 2013, Jenny Burnett and her colleagues put together a meta-analysis, which is a series of studies. You put together a series of studies and you look at all the data together. And so I think it was something like 40 studies and 15, was it 15? No, maybe closer to 5,000 people.
Oh my God.
When they put all the studies together. And they found that in fact there was, a moderate relationship between self-control and forgiveness. And so that folks who tend to be, more able to control themselves are going to be more likely to forgive. Now there's all kinds of cool nuances that have come out since then. And, they've looked at even in some cases where that relationship switches, where actually more self-control was related to less forgiveness in situations of mild transgressions.
Wow.
So I think it's kind of a cool twist on the story. And the researchers argued there that actually self-control is not always in the service of the relationship. Sometimes self-control is in the service of the individual who got hurt.
Wow.
So you could think, if I have a lot of self-control, I'm able to move toward forgiveness most of the time because it's good for me. It's good for my relationships. It's good for my people who I'm in relationship with. But there's sometimes when you hurt me, when I might even be kind of wanting to my impulse might be to forgive just to kind of move on. I got to say, I'm a pretty agreeable person. And that's a great thing most of the time. But I also, the dark side of that is I'm a people pleaser, right? And so if I get hurt, I'm kind of oh, it's okay. Well, no, it's not okay that you did that for the 100th time, right? So can I have enough self-control to actually stand up for myself? So my wife and I have this dance we always do. It's just we go back and forth. And I'm like, oh, it's fine. It's fine. Stop it. She's like, whoa, what happened? I thought it was fine. I was like, well, I did too until 2 seconds ago.
I'm not fine with it.
Apparently, I'm not fine. Right. Exactly. But that takes some self-control is what the researchers are arguing. And what their data around these more mild transgressions seems to suggest is that actually sometimes self-control helps us to protect the self. Which would mean in that case, the way they're measuring forgiveness is, I'm not going to move toward forgiveness just yet. I'm going to hold on to some of this boundary setting anger.
So 2 questions. I am matured now, slightly more.
We hope that for all of us.
I've never been a vengeful person, but I've been a plotter, plotter who doesn't act, So I have great plans, a deck of plans, but never acted on it. So I know this is I'm the ruminator, Ethan Cross was one of our guests and we were talked about it. I'm like, I ruminate when,
I can relate to that.
Ways I could teach you a lesson. And then of course, the angel on my shoulder says, don't kind of thing. But I have been in, compromised by aggressors and transgressors and people, exploitative people. And I have cognitively forgiven them as a strategic decision, not empathically forgiven them. But I'm mature and I'm now one of the biggest profound transformation I have experienced in myself without bragging or anything, that I actually do not see nothing is a big deal. Fine. they wanted to have a better, half of the cake, go ahead. You wanted a better spot, and I mean, I would be one of those people who would come back to my office and write a note saying that somebody's parked their car on that white line, taking 2 spots, just like moral, monitor.
Right. Yes. Yes.
Community monitor. But so I've just like,
right.
F that, let people do their thing.
Right.
And so I've also, I've adopted this Buddhist proverb, which is soft front, firm back. I'm deeply rooted in principles, but I'm not going to school you or tell you what it is, and none of that. I'm going to pass. Oh my God, it's taken a long time. Come on, Nathaniel, help. How can we expedite this process and not wait for maturity of the prefrontal system to take over our life experiences?
I wish I had the key to unlock that one.
Therapy for all?
My brain goes here. The great psychologist answer, of course, if you haven't heard this one yet, is always it depends. And so that's where my brain goes, is like, it depends on the person. So who's coming to me? So you sound maybe a little bit like my wife. Actually, she's a strong, justice-oriented person. Like, she wants it, like, that's not just.
Yes.
And if it's not just, we got to work to make it just, which is a beautiful trait. Right? It's a beautiful trait, and the world certainly needs a lot of that, and a lot
Justice
of the areas
warriors.
Oh, totally, right? We have to have some of that. Fight the power in some ways,
Stick it to the man.
And right. And yet it has its dark side, if you will, as well, which you're talking about, is you can get caught up in kind of petty things. Your mind can be overwhelmed by all the tiny injustices that we experience all the time, and letting go of some of that can be really important. So if you're kind of coming to me from that perspective, then I might say, hey, here's what we're going to work on. We're going to really honor that justice side of you, and how do we find the right avenues for that don't burden you.
So smart.
But if you come to me a little bit more like me, it's like, it's close enough, right? We needed to work on something different with you, right? So now we're going to work. And then when you bring in, kind of before the prefrontal cortex has fully formed, and you start talking about kids, you're a little bit out of my expertise area. However, there is some interesting work that's been done on forgiveness with kids. Bob Enright out of Wisconsin-Madison is really probably one of the leaders on forgiveness with kids, particularly in my area of clinical and counseling psychology. There's others in developmental and others who have done some work, but he's tried to take this whole idea of counseling and psychoeducation and how do we work with kids. And he's done some really interesting studies with a range of hurts that kids have dealt with, and some cases where the kids didn't necessarily, that were more educational itself rather than after they got hurt. And so some cases almost more like prevention. And so he's found ways to kind of move the needle with kids around that, kind of thinking about a kind of a moral development.
Yes.
How do we help kids to understand the value of forgiveness and what that means, and how to act in that, again, in a way that doesn't give up their self-protection, but helps them to move towards something that helps them to avoid the rumination, the revenge, the bitterness that can get us all stuck.
And thank you for really presenting a hopeful scene, because it really feels overwhelming. I mean, people are in rush, people are stressed, people also have high expectations, an incredible desire to succeed at any cost. We have created a monster amongst ourselves by competing in this endless cycle of, life's high achieving goals, which is just ridiculous. But, as I think about this, one question I did have was when, I see, I work with children more than you do, but one thing that I see in the culture, but you do have 2 little ones, so you can relate to this, is that there's so much emphasis I see on politeness. I see parents nudging and say sorry, say thank you, say please.
Yeah.
And I just don't see genuine emotional maturity or emotional agenda being unveiled by the parents. Said that gratitude is what is the reason we should thank people. Sorry is because we need to really acknowledge the responsibility we have in causing the inconvenience or hurt to other people. And so I feel like I see lots of polite people just being asses, forgive my French. And
Right.
and I just wonder what your thoughts are about a society that has adopted this culture. I don't know if this is still true, but Bhutan is the happiest country, right, in the world. And what there's a definite Buddhist culture. It's of course smaller, so you can take a better inventory of you as a community. But this
Yeah.
non-hurried way of living life can also create room for forgiveness. Forgiveness is like a really not hurrying through healing and saying,
Yep.
I've got time because I know you're going to offend me, but I'm not going to get offended because nothing is at stake all the time. So I'm wondering
Right.
what your thoughts are as we end.
Yeah, such good insights. As you think about, how we train kids, what we train kids to do or not do, I think there is certainly in our lifetimes here in the US, there's been I think a real shift around emotional intelligence. So trying to get kids to try and teach kids. So I think there's a lot more that needs to be done and could be done. But you do see movements towards, for example, again, my wife is and has been reaching out to our local school system to do mindfulness work in the schools.
I see.
Right. So just giving kids that idea of be present, just be present in the moment, and how much that could just help. But, when you bring in the idea of then apologies or forgiveness and what that means and how we do that, I mean, those are, they're pretty advanced kinds of skills. As adults, we struggle with that a lot.
Abstract constructs, really. Yeah.
Yes,
Right.
that's right. And so, do we break that down some for kids and we focus on maybe, again, in your wheelhouse, this idea of, can we just control our emotional impulses?
Yeah.
Right. So when so-and-so, teases you, can you keep from smacking them? Right. And then be aware of what's emotionally coming up for you and find other ways to manage that and deal with that. Right. And certainly there are programs and teachers are working with that kind of stuff. Parents are trying to do that kind of work with their kids as well. And so, but the more advanced work around forgiveness, I think it's a wide open area for research and for practitioners to pair up together and to figure out, is there more here that we could be doing for our kids to give them that head start to be able to be working on these kinds of maybe a little bit more complex issues, but certainly ones that could be extremely helpful.
Well, Nathaniel, it has been nothing but fantastic conversation. And
thank you. It's been great.
I do feel, one of my aspirations is to be known as a very kind person. And so as a spiritual goal, and I have, I send, I wouldn't say every month, but every other month, I reach out to my community, like my family, my mom and some of my friends, and just say, how would you rate me on kindness? So for me, I think what is
getting feedback. This is good.
I'm ready. I'm bringing my courage, A game in courage. But I think what I've realized that I am a kind person at heart. A lack of patience is what makes me unkind. So if I worked on my patience, I think I can be much kinder. So it's really that unhurried way is really my aspiration.
Yeah.
So as I end this conversation, what are, if you have some recommendations of books that you have read and loved for our audience, I would love that.
Yeah. Yeah. So a little shameless self-promotion. The Handbook of Forgiveness that I
highly endorse it.
I highly endorse it. So that's came out in 2020. Ev Worthington and I edited that. And so it's a collection of 30 plus chapters on forgiveness, just a range of stuff from, we talked about measuring forgiveness. It's in there. It's culture and forgiveness, interventions to forgive. It's just a great survey of the research in the area that's written in a really accessible way. That's Handbook of Forgiveness, second edition,
Right.
I would say is a good place to go for people interested in forgiveness. And then I would say, one book that totally off topic in some ways, although the idea of forgiveness and diversity and culture and oppression is certainly something we could talk about. But I think one book that's had probably one of the biggest impacts on me over the last 2 years has been Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility.
That.
So, as someone who obviously is very Anglo, and grew up a really privileged life, being able to read through that and to see like the impact of kind of white supremacy, the impact of my own training that was reflected in what she talked about in her own upbringing, really powerful insights into the ways I see my world, but I don't see the oppression around me very often. And so, again, forgiveness could be brought into that, but super powerful book, especially for your white and more privileged listeners.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for being here with us.
Yeah.
And
my pleasure.
Really sensational conversation, and you're so generous with your insights and your time. So, all right, that's all the time we have for today. As you can see, these are important conversations we are having with knowledgeable, incredibly qualified and passionate experts like Dr. Nathaniel Wade. Please, I will be adding all these resources, so do check our website. And the handbook, really, for the nerds out there, that's a fantastic. And I shouldn't really make that about nerds, but please, I know those who want to do a deep dive. It's a good little handbook to have by your bedside. And so once again, please share what if you love what you're hearing, please share with your friends, your colleagues. And if you take a moment, leave us a review. Always love that. And finally, be sure to subscribe to Full Prefrontal using your favorite listening app whenever or wherever you can find us. Looking forward to seeing you again here in the same space, right here next time on Full Prefrontal.
Thank you for listening to Full Prefrontal, exposing the mysteries of executive function. To contact your host, Sucheta Kamath, and learn more about her work on improving executive function, visit her website at exqinfiniteknowhow.com. That's www.exqinfiniteknowhow.com. Tune in next week for another informative episode of Full Prefrontal, hosted by the founder of EXQ, Sucheta Kamath.